Hey everybody, welcome back. The only thing that I factored into when I was rating the books that I read was my enjoyment factor when I read them. If you disagree with any of them, that's perfectly fine. I get it. These are just the 15 books that I enjoyed most in 2015. Book number 1 is The Fox by Sherwood Smith. This is book 2 of the Enda Quartet. I've only read the first 3 books, but this by far is the best one. Enda held a lot of promise. The Fox fulfilled on that. The Fox was really interesting. It's a big book. I flew through it. It was very engaging, a real page turner, a good example of excellent fantasy book. Number 14 is also a good example of a fantasy book. I don't have a physical copy because I listened to it on ebook, and I liked it so much I want to buy a physical copy. Been unable to get my hands on one though, and that is Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan. It is book 1 of the Raven trilogy, Raven Shadow, Raven Song. I don't know. The trilogy name has something to do with ravens. That's all I know. But Bloodsong by Anthony Ryan is the book. It is the first book in a fantasy trilogy, and there was just something about it. Typically, the book, if you looked at the parts individually, would not have been a book I enjoyed that much, but the way that Ryan combined them together, the finished product was absolutely amazing. I had gone a couple months without reading much fantasy because I wasn't in the mood, and Bloodsong rekindled my love for it. It's also one I haven't seen talked about on BookTube a lot, even though I haven't really been involved much in the past month, but it's one I think should definitely be talked about as a very good book. Number 13 is Star Wars Darth Maul Lockdown by Joe Schreiber. I kind of have a tendency to like books featuring Darth Maul. I think a lot of times the Sith can be too absorbed with taking over the galaxy or too absorbed with trying to convince people the dark side's more powerful, whereas Darth Maul's sole and only concern is just being a badass and something that he does just amazingly well. Thoroughly enjoy books with Darth Maul, and Lockdown by Joe Schreiber was an excellent example of a good Star Wars book. Number 12 is The Old Man's War by John Scalzi. This is book 1 of the Old Man's War series, and this was the first John Scalzi I read. I would definitely recommend it if you're thinking about getting into John Scalzi. Even though it's the first book of a series, you can kind of read them individually, and you don't immediately have to jump to the next one, because I've only read the first 2 in the series. This was a very good book. It's not very long, in case you can tell. It's a pretty easy read. It's very interesting because the main character is 75, which you don't normally see in science fiction. But yeah, very, very enjoyable. Number 11 was The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. This was my first Ray Bradbury, and it was just absolutely stunningly beautiful. Even though it's not a novel, it's a collection of short stories on the same topic that are set up in chronological order, which is something that I was very skeptical of going into, but it was just stunningly beautifully written. You should definitely read this one. Number 10 is As You Wish, Inconceivable Tales from the Making of the Princess Bride by Cary Elwes. I listened to this book actually, and the audiobook is narrated by Cary Elwes. I would definitely recommend listening to the audiobook if you can, because Cary Elwes is a masterful storyteller, and even though I'm sure reading the book would be enjoyable, having him read it to you was very, very enjoyable. Listen to this one with my wife, which is probably, to be honest, part of the reason it's on the top 10. It's the only non-fiction book that I have on the top 10, but it was very, very good. And I realize now that I keep telling people to go read these books. If it's on my top 15 of 2015, it's obviously going to be something that I recommend to people to read. So I'm going to try and cut that out from now on for the sake of brevity. And so I'm not saying the same thing after 15 different books. Number 9 is The Red House Mystery by A.A. Milne, who's the creator of Winnie the Pooh, which is why I bought this book. It's not very long, and it's just a very good murder mystery. It was very enjoyable. Probably one of my most surprising books of 2015. Number 8 is Have Spacesuit Will Travel by Robert Heinlein. This was my second Robert Heinlein. If you are a fan of old school science fiction, read this book. It is very good and a more lighthearted read, just very, very enjoyable. Number 7 is Animal Farm by George Orwell. Yes, this was my first time reading the book, and yes, I absolutely loved it. It's not a very big book at all. I listened to the audiobook and listened through the entire thing in one day, so you can knock it out pretty quick. I loved this book. I think it's one of my favorite classics, definitely up there. Just a very good book. Number 6 is Monster by Frank Peretti. If you are into like a suspense thriller that takes place in the great outdoors, this is a very good book to start with, and this is a good example of me reading the right book at the right time. I don't know if normally this would have made the top, it probably would have made the top 15. I don't know if it normally would have made it as high as number 6, but it was the book, like it was exactly what I wanted at the time that I read it, and it just was phenomenal. Number 5 was The Seawolf by Jack London. This was one of 5 books that I read by Jack London this year, and this was the first one actually. I think I read this one in like September or something, so I read all of them in the last half of the year. Seawolf was definitely my favorite. It's also one of his more popular books. A very, very good book. Jack London seems to be able to like look at humanity and look straight to the soul of humanity. It's just, I absolutely love his writing style. Number 4 is the Mistborn Trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. This is 3 of the 7 Brandon Sanderson books that I read this year, and it's phenomenal. This is the best completed fantasy series I've ever read, and in my opinion, it took what I thought fantasy series could do and raised that bar even higher. Absolutely just an incredible series, and honestly it's pretty easy to read. They're all like 600-700 pages, which is a little bit longer but pretty short for Brandon Sanderson compared to some of his other stuff, and just a real easy, enjoyable read. I said I wouldn't recommend books anymore, but yeah, definitely if you have not read them yet, you should. Number 3 is the Deadlock Trilogy by P.T. Hylton. I think every time I mention P.T. Hylton, I tell people they should immediately go out and read his books, so I'm not going to do that this time. This is kind of a genre that's, one, is hard to define, and secondly, not a genre that I would typically read, but I really, really enjoyed these. I read The Place Without Shadows in one day because it was that freaking good. Number 2 is Star Wars Dark Disciple by Christie Golding. This, I think, is the only book of 2015 to make me cry. It surprised the hell out of me in terms of a Star Wars book. It had a lot more heart than I expected. It had a pretty good romance, especially for Star Wars. Just absolutely phenomenal. Then for my number 1 book of 2015, it was kind of a no-brainer for me. That was The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, and yes, this book is so big that this publisher decided to break it up into 2 books because combined it's 1,000 pages. But this, to me, is everything that I love about big, drawn-out, epic fantasy books. I just really, really good. This was also the book that turned me on to Brandon Sanderson. It was the first of his that I read. I just had nothing but good things to say about this book, and I'm 80% of the way through Words of Radiance, which is book 2 in the series. And I'm going to be so sad until book 3 comes out, because this series is just everything you could want an epic fantasy series to be. So that was my top 15 of 2015. Please let me know what your favorite book you read in 2015 was, because I feel that well, at least for like 2014, like the kind of unanimous pick was Ready Player One, and I don't feel there was that type of book in 2015. So I would be very interested in hearing what your favorite book was. You can also feel free to like or subscribe if the mood hits you just right. And until next time, bye.